So because many are optimistic of Frank Martin's chances against Tank, and with so many choosing to rock with the legitimate underdog that is Frank the Ghost Martin, I would like to point out something that the majority who are favoring Tank may have not even considered. Because lately, I've been hearing a lot of fans and spectators complain or bring up the rehydration clause, and although that can have a massive impact on the outcome whether you think it's right or not, what stood out to me more than anything is the fact that Frank Martin and Errol Spence said that if Frank wins, there has to be a rematch. Spence's exact words were, well, there gotta be a rematch, with Martin following that up saying there definitely will be a rematch. Almost as if they were implying that Tank has an undisclosed rematch clause for the fight. Now, most big fights do have rematch clauses, specifically when it's a unification bout or simply just because the favorite makes a request for it in the contract. And since Martin confidently made the statement that Shakur Stevenson will be next after he defeats, then gives Tank Davis a rematch, I have no other choice but to believe one of two things. Either Frank and Spence are assuming Tank will want a rematch due to the sting suffering your first defeat can have on a fighter, or that there is indeed a rematch clause, and maybe, just maybe, Gervonta Tank Davis does view Frank Martin as a legitimate threat. Tank has been all nonchalant about it, even clowning Frank Martin as if to say he isn't worried at all. Of course, that's what you have to do when you're the man, but the fact of the matter is that Tank is training his ass off for this fight as he should be, especially after being away from the ring for a year and 3 months. It's just that knowing he possibly does have a rematch clause in the event that an upset happens might tell us that Tank respects Frank Martin more than he would like us to believe. And I mean, why shouldn't he? Listen, you could sit up here and say, oh, rematch clauses are mandatory, or Tank's gonna dog walk him. Martin and Spence are just saying that because of the revenue a rematch will draw in. And sure, that very well may be the case, but it's like I said before, Tank is smart, and who knows what kind of conversations are being had behind the scenes when no one's looking. At the end of the day, when you add the possibility of a possible rematch clause in with the fact that there is definitely a rehydration clause, actions will always speak louder than words. And from the looks of it, it doesn't matter what Tank says out of his mouth. He's definitely taking this fight with Frank Martin on June 15th very serious, and rightfully so. Because in the event that a possible upset does happen, there's really only 3 ways I could see a Frank Martin win playing out, which could also play a factor or change the dynamic on if an immediate rematch does take place. 1. Every possible thing that can go wrong for Tank does go wrong on the night of June 15th, with Martin being at his absolute best and basically paralleling George Kambosos Jr. versus Teofimo Lopez. 2. Frank Martin ends up being Tank's toughest opponent since Isaac Pitbull Cruz, but gets his arm raised in a competitive close bout with a possible controversial decision. Or 3. Since boxing is the theater of the unexpected and anything can happen, Frank Martin stuns Tank and gets him up out of there by way of knockout, shocking the world. Either of those outcomes would have an effect on when and where a rematch takes place. If Martin gets the nod in a close bout, I can see an immediate rematch happening due to not only the supply and demand from fight fans, but of course because Tank will be pissed off and pressing the issue. But if Martin were to actually bash Tank's head in, the more least than likely outcome, there might be a situation where maybe Tank and his team won't be so quick to rush a rematch, targeting a tune-up fight instead. Which brings me to Tank's next possible opponent after Frank Martin and who that may be. Now, I was under the impression that because of Frank Martin's style, Tank could be eyeing and actually serious about facing Vasyl Lomachenko next. And if you watched my last video, you would know that I've been very invested on the possibility of that fight happening. Here's where my initial indication may have been off though, and something that I may have honestly overlooked. There is a fight on the undercard of the June 15th bout that will feature the hard-hitting, impressive prospect that is known as Gary Antoine Russell, younger brother of fighter and now trainer Gary Russell Jr. Antoine Russell has been flying under the radar these past couple years, basically only known to hardcores but infamous to casuals. He has a bit of hype surrounding his future, with experts promoting him to have a promising career even more so than the rest of his brothers. Russell usually fights at catchweights between the light and super lightweight divisions, with a record of 17 wins, 17 KOs, and just 1 fight lesser than Frank Martin has on his resume. With Russell being on the undercard, I honestly wouldn't be surprised if, win or lose, we see Tank stepping into the ring with him next. Now to some that could be a stretch and maybe even a disappointment, since we want to see Tank jumping in there with the likes of Shakur, Loma, Teofimo, and Haney. But because PBC is known to hype up fighters on their current stars undercards, I really wouldn't rule out this being a future matchup, whether that's sooner or later. And if that bug-eyed boy Frank Martin fucks up everyone's plans, all I have to say is brace yourselves, because at this point nothing can be overlooked. Papa.